The fluorescent lights hummed in the archives room of the Western Carolina University Library on a cold February morning in 2019. Dr. Margaret Hayes, a historian specializing in Appalachian studies, carefully lifted a cardboard box from the metal shelf. Dust particles danced in the air as she set it down on the wooden table. The box had been donated 3 months earlier by the estate of a deceased schoolteacher from Watauga County, North Carolina. Margaret was 53 years old, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had spent 30 years researching the educational history of mountain communities, documenting the struggles and triumphs of rural schools in the early 20th century. Her office walls were covered with photographs of one-room schoolhouses, faded class pictures, and handwritten attendance records that told stories of children who walked miles through snow to learn their letters. This particular morning, she had already examined 3 other boxes from the same donation, mostly mundane teaching materials, grade books with careful notations in fading ink, and lesson plans that revealed the daily rhythms of rural education. She wasn't expecting anything extraordinary from this 4th box. Archives work was often tedious, requiring patience and attention to detail. Most days yielded nothing remarkable. But Margaret had learned that persistence was the historian's greatest tool. She opened the box methodically, removing yellowed notebooks, lesson plans written in elegant cursive, and stacks of papers tied with brittle ribbon. The smell of old paper filled her nostrils, a scent she had come to associate with discovery. Near the bottom, wrapped in brown paper, she found a collection of photographs. Margaret's practiced hands carefully unwrapped the bundle. The first few images were typical. Children standing in rows outside a wooden schoolhouse, their faces serious in that way people posed for cameras in the early 1900s. Then she pulled out a photograph that made her pause. The image showed approximately 40 children arranged in neat rows on the front steps of a schoolhouse. The building behind them was typical of the era. Unpainted wood planks, a single door, windows with simple frames. The children wore their Sunday best. Girls in long dresses with their hair neatly braided or tied with ribbons, boys in suspenders and caps. A stern-looking woman in a high-collared dress stood to one side, clearly the teacher. But something felt wrong. Margaret had examined hundreds of school photographs from this period and region. She knew the demographics of Appalachian communities in the early 1900s. While the mountain regions were predominantly white, there were established African American communities throughout western North Carolina, particularly families who had lived free before the Civil War or had migrated to the mountains seeking work in timber camps and mines. She turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink, Oak Ridge School, Watauga County, North Carolina. Spring 1907. Miss Sarah Whitfield, teacher. Margaret set the photograph down and walked to the window. Outside, students hurried across campus between classes, bundled against the February cold. She thought about her own schooling, the diverse classrooms she had experienced, the way education had evolved over the past century. Then she returned to the photograph, studying it with renewed focus. Margaret reached for her laptop and began searching historical census records. Within 20 minutes, she had confirmed what her instincts told her. The 1900 census listed at least 12 African American families living within the Oak Ridge School District. Families with children. School-aged children who should have been in that photograph. But they weren't there. She looked more closely at the image, this time examining not just who was in the frame, but the composition itself. The photograph had been taken from a position on the dirt road in front of the school. The children filled the frame from edge to edge. And then Margaret noticed something else. On the far left side of the image, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, was what appeared to be the shoulder and arm of a child wearing a dark-colored dress. The child had been cut off by the photographer's framing, or perhaps by whoever had later cropped the image. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. She had stumbled onto something significant. She photographed the image with her phone, then with her high-resolution scanner. She adjusted the contrast and brightness, examining every pixel. The more she looked, the more convinced she became that someone had deliberately framed this photograph to exclude certain children. The composition was too careful, too intentional. Professional photographers of that era understood framing and typically centered their subjects. This photographer had positioned the camera to capture specific children while leaving others literally outside the frame. She spent the rest of that day and the next 3 weeks diving deep into research. She contacted the Watauga County Historical Society, examined property records, and tracked down descendants of families who had lived in the Oak Ridge community in 1907. She discovered land deeds showing that several African American families had owned property near the school. She found church records indicating baptisms and marriages. She located obituaries and census data. The families had existed. The children had existed. But they had been deliberately excluded from the official school photograph. Margaret also discovered something else during her research. Photographs from that era were expensive. Having a professional photographer come to a rural mountain school would have cost money that would have been paid by the families or by local fundraising. The photograph wasn't just a casual snapshot, it was a significant investment, a deliberate act of creating a historical record. And someone had decided that records should exclude black children. She found records showing that other schools in neighboring counties had taken similar photographs around the same time. Some included all students regardless of race. Others, like Oak Ridge, had excluded African American children. The pattern suggested that decisions about inclusion and exclusion were made locally, by individual teachers, school boards, or communities. This wasn't always about state-level segregation laws. It was about everyday choices made by ordinary people. Margaret decided to travel to Watauga County to investigate further. The county seat of Boone sat nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a small town that had grown considerably since 1907 but still retained some of its historical character. She arrived on a Thursday in March, when the last patches of snow clung to the shadowed hillsides and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The Historical Society occupied a renovated Victorian house on a side street. Margaret was greeted by Thomas Gardner, a retired schoolteacher who volunteered as the Society's archivist. He was a tall man in his 70s with weathered hands and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Dr. Hayes," he said, shaking her hand firmly, "I was fascinated by your phone call. I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen that photograph before, but I never questioned what wasn't in it." They sat in the research room surrounded by filing cabinets and shelves of bound volumes. Thomas had prepared several boxes of materials related to Oak Ridge School. "The schoolhouse burned down in 1923, Thomas explained. "But we have some records that survived. Attendance logs, a few letters. The building stood about 5 miles outside of town, up in the hills. There's nothing there now but a clearing and a historical marker." Margaret opened her notebook. "I've confirmed that at least 12 African American families lived in that district in 1907. The census shows they had children ranging from age 6 to 15. Those children should have been in school." Thomas nodded slowly. "They probably were in school. Just not in that photograph. Can you tell me what the situation was like here in 1907? I know North Carolina had implemented Jim Crow laws, but the enforcement varied by region." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more serious. Mountain communities were complicated. You had white families who had fought for the Confederacy living alongside families who had been pro-Union. You had people whose ancestors had owned slaves, though slavery was less common in the mountains than in the Piedmont or coastal regions. And you had free black families who had lived here for generations, plus families who came after the war looking for work. He pulled out a folder. "I found something interesting in our collection. A letter from 1906, written by a county school superintendent to the State Board of Education. He was requesting funds for a separate school building for Negro children in the Oak Ridge district." Margaret felt a chill. Was it built? No. The funding was denied. The official reason was insufficient enrollment to justify a separate facility. But I think the real reason was that the county didn't want to spend money on education for black children. "So what happened to those children?" Thomas spread his hands. "That's what we need to find out." Over the next 2 days, Margaret and Thomas combed through every document related to Oak Ridge School. They found attendance records that were maddeningly incomplete. The record keeping was inconsistent, some months carefully documented, others with gaps. Margaret noticed that the months with the most missing data tended to be spring and fall, the planting and harvest seasons when children of all races were often kept home to work on family farms. They discovered that Miss Sarah Whitfield, the teacher in the photograph, had kept a personal journal, but it had been destroyed when her house flooded in 1935. However, they found several letters she had written to her sister, who lived in Raleigh. The letters, preserved in the sister's family papers and later donated to the state archives, painted a picture of a dedicated but conventional woman who accepted the racial hierarchies of her time without question. In one letter dated March 1907, Miss Whitfield wrote, "Teaching here in the mountains is challenging but rewarding. I have 42 pupils, though not all attend regularly. The white children are eager to learn, though some of the older boys can be obstinate. The colored children sit in back and cause no trouble." Margaret read that letter 3 times, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger. Miss Whitfield's casual dismissal of the black students as people who cause no trouble revealed everything. They weren't seen as real students with potential and aspirations. They were afterthoughts, tolerated but not valued. They located the names of students who appeared in the 1907 photograph by comparing it to a graduation list from 1915. Of the 40 children in the photograph, 18 eventually completed their education at Oak Ridge School. The others either moved away, were needed for farm work, or attended for only a few years before their families left the area. And they found one more thing: a newspaper clipping from the Watauga County Democrat dated May 1907. The brief article announced that Oak Ridge School had held its annual May Day celebration and that a photographer from Boone had been hired to take a commemorative photograph of the students. The article made no mention of African American children. Margaret photographed every document, filled 3 notebooks with handwritten notes, and made a list of families whose descendants might still live in the area. As she prepared to leave Boone, Thomas walked her to her car. "What are you going to do with this information?" he asked. Margaret looked back at the Historical Society building. "I'm going to find out what really happened. Those children deserve to have their story told. It won't be easy. A lot of people don't like talking about this kind of history. Some folks think we should just forget about the past and move on." "I know," Margaret said, "but forgetting isn't the same as healing. And those children, they lived real lives. They had hopes and dreams. They deserved better than to be erased from history." Thomas nodded. "You know, I've been teaching history in this county for 40 years. I thought I knew the story. But this is making me realize how much I didn't see, didn't question. Thank you for opening my eyes." She drove back to her university with the copied documents secured in a box on her passenger seat and a determination in her heart that felt both exciting and heavy. The drive through the mountains gave her time to think. She passed through small towns where historical markers told sanitized versions of the past, celebrating progress and prosperity while omitting the stories of those who had been marginalized. As the sun set behind the ridgeline, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Margaret thought about the responsibility of historians. It wasn't enough to simply record what happened. They had to ask who got recorded and who didn't. They had to question the archives themselves, recognizing that historical records reflected the biases of those who created them. The invisible children of Oak Ridge School had been invisible by design, not by accident. And Margaret was determined to make them visible again. Margaret spent the next month building a database of every person who had lived in the Oak Ridge community in 1907. She used census records, property deeds, church registries, and marriage licenses. She created family trees, mapping out relationships and tracking descendants. The white families in the photograph were relatively easy to trace. Many of their descendants still lived in Watauga County, and several had already been documented by the Historical Society. The African American families were harder to track. Many had left the area in the decades following 1907, part of the Great Migration that saw millions of Black Americans move from the rural South to northern cities seeking better opportunities and escape from Jim Crow oppression. Records were often incomplete or had been poorly maintained. Some families had changed their surnames over the years, making genealogical research challenging. Margaret discovered that record-keeping for African American families in early 20th century North Carolina was often deliberately neglected. Birth certificates might list colored, without a full name. Death certificates sometimes recorded only first names. Property transactions involving black landowners were occasionally filed incorrectly or incompletely. It was as if the bureaucratic system itself conspired to make these families harder to trace, easier to forget. But Margaret was patient and thorough. She reached out to churches with predominantly black congregations in nearby counties. She posted inquiries on genealogy websites and contacted historical societies throughout North Carolina. She spent hours on Ancestry.com and Family Search, following tenuous leads through multiple generations. Slowly, she began to piece together the stories of the families who had been excluded from that photograph. One name appeared repeatedly in the records: the Freeman family. According to the 1900 census, Samuel and Martha Freeman owned 40 acres of land near Oak Ridge School. They had 5 children in 1907: Isaiah, age 14, Eliza, age 12, Thomas, age 9, Grace, age 7, and baby Ruth, who would have been too young for school. The older 4 children should have been enrolled at Oak Ridge School. Margaret discovered that Samuel Freeman had purchased his land in 1889, paying in cash earned from working as a timber cutter. The deed was carefully preserved in the county records, Samuel's signature written in a clear, confident hand that suggested literacy and pride. Property records showed he had steadily improved the farm, adding outbuildings and clearing land for crops. By 1907, the Freeman farm was one of the more prosperous small holdings in the district, producing corn, beans, and raising pigs and chickens. She found tax records showing that Samuel Freeman had paid his property taxes on time every year, despite the economic challenges that small farmers faced. She found a warranty deed showing he had helped a neighbor, a white farmer named John Patterson, by providing labor during harvest season in exchange for use of a mule team. The relationship between the families appeared cordial, at least on paper, but Margaret wondered how that cordiality translated into daily life, into questions of respect and equality. She found a wedding announcement from 1925 showing that Eliza Freeman had married a man named Robert Jackson and moved to Asheville. From there, Margaret traced the family forward through time. Eliza and Robert had 4 children. 2 of their daughters were still alive, one in Charlotte, one in Durham. Margaret picked up the phone and called the number she had found for Dorothy Jackson Williams, Eliza Freeman's granddaughter. An older woman answered on the 3rd ring. "Mrs. Jackson Williams? My name is Dr. Margaret Hayes. I'm a historian at Western Carolina University, and I'm researching the history of Oak Ridge School in Watauga County. I believe your grandmother, Eliza Freeman Jackson, lived near that school in the early 1900s. There was a long pause. Then, yes, my grandmother was from up in those mountains. She didn't talk much about it, but I know she lived there when she was young. Would you be willing to meet with me? I'm trying to understand what education was like for African American children in that community." Another pause. Why? Margaret understood the hesitation. She had conducted enough oral history interviews to know that many people, especially elderly African Americans, were cautious about sharing family stories with white researchers. Too many times, those stories had been exploited or misrepresented. Too many white academics had built careers on black suffering without giving anything back to the communities they studied. "I found a photograph," Margaret said carefully. "A school photograph from 1907. Your grandmother should have been in it, but she wasn't. None of the black children were. I want to understand why and tell the truth about what happened. Not as an academic exercise, but because these children's stories deserve to be known. Because your grandmother deserves to be remembered." She heard Dorothy take a deep breath. "You'd better come to Charlotte. I'll tell you what my grandmother told me, but you need to understand, this was painful for her. She carried it her whole life. If you're going to write about her, you need to treat her story with respect." "I promise you I will," Margaret said. "Your grandmother's dignity matters more than my research." 3 days later, Margaret sat in Dorothy Jackson Williams's living room in a modest neighborhood in East Charlotte. Dorothy was 81 years old, with silver hair and sharp eyes. The house was immaculate, filled with photographs of children and grandchildren. On the coffee table, she had spread out a collection of family photographs and documents. My grandmother passed in 1984, Dorothy began. I was 36 years old, and she was 92. Near the end, she started talking more about her childhood. I think she wanted someone to remember. She said to me, "Baby, don't let them forget we were there. Don't let them act like we didn't exist." Dorothy picked up an old photograph. This is her, probably taken around 1920. The image showed a dignified young woman in a white dress, her expression serious but with a hint of warmth in her eyes. Grandmother Eliza told me that her family lived in the mountains near a white school. Her daddy owned land, good land. He grew crops and raised animals. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. Her mother taught her to read using an old Bible before she ever went to school. Education was important to them. They believed it was the way forward. Did she attend Oak Ridge School? Margaret asked. Dorothy nodded. She did at first. She said the white teacher, Miss Whitfield, allowed the black children to attend, but there were rules. They had to sit in the back corner of the room. They couldn't use the same water bucket as the white children. They had to wait until all the white children had been dismissed before they could leave. And they couldn't participate in any special events or programs. Christmas pageants, spelling bees, recitations, those were only for the white children. Margaret felt anger rising in her chest but kept her voice neutral. What about the photograph? Do you know what happened? Grandmother Eliza remembered that day very clearly, Dorothy said, her voice taking on a storytelling cadence. It was in May, near the end of the school year. The weather was warm and the mountain laurel was blooming. A man came with a big camera on a tripod, a photographer from town. All the children were excited because having your photograph taken was a special event back then. Most families didn't own cameras. Dorothy paused, her eyes distant. Miss Whitfield told all the children to line up on the steps for a picture. Grandmother Eliza and her brothers and the other black children lined up with everyone else. They straightened their clothes and smoothed their hair. Grandmother Eliza had worn her best dress that day, a blue one her mother had sewn for Easter. Margaret leaned forward, her heart aching for that 12-year-old girl in her Easter dress. Then Miss Whitfield told them to step aside. She said the photograph was only for the regular students. That's the word she used, regular. As if my grandmother and the others weren't real students. As if they didn't belong. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. What did your grandmother do? She said they stood there on the side while the photograph was taken. She watched all the white children smile for the camera. She saw children she had studied with, played with during recess, shared her lunch with. And she realized, right then, that no matter how hard she studied or how well she behaved, she would never be seen as equal. She was 12 years old, and the world told her she wasn't good enough to be in a photograph. Dorothy pulled out another document, a baptismal certificate from 1898 showing Eliza Freeman's christening at Mt. Zion Baptist Church. After that photograph, Grandmother Eliza's father pulled all his children out of Oak Ridge School. He was furious. My grandmother said she had never seen him so angry. He was a quiet man, dignified, but that day he confronted Miss Whitfield. He told her his children were just as good as any white child, just as deserving of respect. What did Miss Whitfield say? Margaret asked. Grandmother said the teacher looked uncomfortable, but she didn't apologize. She said she was following community standards. That's what she called it, community standards. As if cruelty could be justified by calling it a standard. Dorothy's voice grew stronger. After that, my great-grandfather tried to get the county to build a separate school for black children. He gathered signatures from other black families, wrote letters to the school board. But they refused. So the families in the community organized their own school. They met in the church. Different parents took turns teaching. It wasn't much, but it was something. My grandmother said those parents were determined that their children would learn to read and write, no matter what obstacles the white community put in their way. Margaret spent 3 hours with Dorothy, taking careful notes and scanning family documents. She learned that Eliza Freeman had been an excellent student, gifted in mathematics. She learned that after leaving Oak Ridge School, Eliza had continued her education through the community school and later attended a school for black students in Asheville. She had become a teacher herself, spending 40 years educating black children in segregated schools. She never forgot that photograph day, Dorothy said. Even when she was old, in her 80s, she would sometimes mention it. The feeling of standing aside, watching other children have their moment while she was told she didn't matter. But you know what? She used that pain. She told every student she ever taught that they mattered, that they were important, that nobody had the right to make them feel invisible. As she prepared to leave, Dorothy handed her a worn leather journal. This was my grandmother's diary. She started keeping it when she was 15. She wrote about her childhood, about leaving the mountains, about her life. You can borrow it, but I want it back. It's precious to me. Margaret held the journal carefully. I'll guard it with my life. And Dorothy, thank you. Your grandmother's story matters. All those children's stories matter. Dorothy walked her to the door. You know what Grandmother Eliza told me before she died? She said she forgave Miss Whitfield. She said that teacher was just doing what society told her was right, following rules she probably never questioned. But she never forgot the feeling of being told she wasn't regular. She said that pain stayed with her forever. She said it shaped how she saw herself, even though she knew, intellectually, that the judgment was wrong. That's what discrimination does. It gets inside you, even when you know it's unjust. As Margaret drove back to Boone, she thought about Eliza Freeman standing to the side while her classmates had their photograph taken. A 12-year-old girl learning that the world saw her as less than human. And she understood that this wasn't just a historical curiosity. This was a story about dignity, about the wounds that discrimination inflicts, and about the strength it takes to survive in a society that denies your full humanity. She had 2 more families to track down, and she was determined to tell all their stories. Margaret returned to Watauga County in late April, when the mountains were brilliant with spring wildflowers and the dogwood trees bloomed white against the green hillsides. She had made significant progress researching 2 other families who had lived near Oak Ridge School, the Wilsons and the DeVises. The Wilson family had been more difficult to trace. According to census records, Peter and Hannah Wilson had 3 children in 1907, Jacob, age 11, Mary, age 8, and Samuel, age 6. Peter Wilson worked as a farm laborer, hiring himself out during planting and harvest seasons. The family rented a small cabin on land owned by a white farmer. Margaret found that the Wilsons had left Watauga County sometime between 1910 and 1920. The trail went cold in Tennessee, then picked up again in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she found death certificates for Peter and Hannah Wilson dated 1938 and 1941. Their children had scattered, one to Detroit, one to Cleveland, one lost to the records entirely. She finally located a great-grandson named Marcus Wilson living in Columbus, Ohio. He was a 58-year-old engineer who was surprised but interested in her research. They spoke on the phone for over an hour. I knew my great-grandparents came from North Carolina, Marcus told her. But nobody really talked about why they left. My grandfather, Jacob Wilson, died before I was born, but my father said he was a hard man. Worked himself to the bone. Never talked about his childhood except to say it was hard. Do you know anything about his education? Margaret asked. Not much. I know he could read and write, but I don't think he went to school very long. My father always emphasized education. He made sure all us kids went to college. He said his grandfather had been denied opportunities, and he wanted to make sure we had every chance. He used to say, education is the one thing nobody can take from you. I didn't understand what he meant until I was older. Margaret was learning that this was a common pattern. The children who had been excluded from that photograph, who had grown up under Jim Crow segregation, often pushed their own children and grandchildren toward education as a path to dignity and success. The wounds of discrimination became motivation for the next generation. My father told me one story about his grandfather, Marcus continued. He said that Jacob Wilson never had his photograph taken as a child. Never. And when my father was born, one of the first things my grandfather did was hire a photographer to take a family portrait. My father said his grandfather looked at that photograph every day of his life. It was like he was proving something, that he existed, that his family mattered, that they deserved to be seen and remembered. Margaret felt a lump in her throat. Marcus, I think your great-grandfather was supposed to be in a school photograph in 1907, but he was excluded because of his race. I'm trying to piece together what happened and why." There was a long silence. Then Marcus said quietly, "So that's why. I always wondered why my grandfather was so insistent about photographs. Now it makes sense." The Davis family proved easier to research. George and Sarah Davis had owned a small farm adjacent to the Freeman property. They had 2 daughters, Lillian, age 10, and Rose, age 8, in 1907. Margaret discovered that both girls had eventually left North Carolina, but Rose Davis had returned to the mountains in her old age, settling in nearby Avery County. Through church contacts, Margaret learned that Rose Davis Carmichael had passed away in 2003, but her daughter, Evelyn Carmichael, still lived in the family house. She was 75 years old and initially hesitant when Margaret called. "My mother didn't like to talk about the old days," Evelyn said cautiously. She said it was better to look forward than backward. "I understand," Margaret replied, "but sometimes looking backward helps us understand how we got to where we are. And it honors the people who struggled so we could have better lives." Evelyn agreed to meet. Her house sat on a narrow mountain road, surrounded by rhododendron and mountain laurel. She greeted Margaret at the door with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. They sat at the kitchen table, where Evelyn served sweet tea in mason jars. The afternoon sun streamed through lace curtains, creating patterns of light on the worn wooden floor. "My mother was proud," Evelyn began. She didn't see herself as a victim, even though she had every right to. She used to say she survived by keeping her dignity, no matter what. She said dignity was something you gave yourself. Nobody could take it from you unless you let them. Margaret opened her notebook. Did she ever mention Oak Ridge School? Evelyn nodded slowly. She talked about it once, maybe 20 years ago. We were watching the news, something about a school integration case, and she made a comment. She said, "They didn't want us in their picture, but they wanted to count us as students when it came time for state funding." Margaret looked up sharply. What did she mean by that? I asked her the same thing. She explained it to me. She said that the schools reported enrollment numbers to the state to get funding, and they counted the black children in those numbers. But when it came time for photographs or programs or graduation ceremonies, the black children weren't allowed to participate. They were good enough to bring money to the school, but not good enough to be seen. Margaret felt a wave of disgust. This was an aspect she hadn't considered. She made a note to research state education funding formulas from that era. The hypocrisy was staggering. Black children used as financial resources while being denied recognition and full participation. My mother told me that her family left the mountains when she was about 13, Evelyn continued. Her father got work in Tennessee, in a coal mine. It was dangerous work, but he said at least in the mining camps, black men got paid the same as white men for the same job. That was better than farming in North Carolina, where white landowners could cheat you and you had no legal recourse. They talked for 2 hours. Evelyn showed Margaret photographs of her mother as an older woman, her face showing the weathering of hard work but also a quiet strength. She shared stories her mother had told about the Freeman family, who had been their neighbors and friends. The Freemans were leaders in the community, Evelyn said. My mother always spoke highly of Samuel Freeman. She said he was determined that his children would have better lives. When the county wouldn't build a school for black children, he and some other families tried to hire a teacher themselves. They pooled their money, but it wasn't enough. The salary they could afford wasn't enough to attract a qualified teacher willing to work in such a remote area. Evelyn pulled out a small wooden box from a cabinet. Inside were letters, yellowed with age. These are letters my grandmother wrote to my mother after the family moved to Tennessee. I found them after my mother passed. They talk about life in the mountains, about the people they left behind. Margaret carefully examined the letters. One, dated August 1920, mentioned the Freeman family. Samuel Freeman's daughter Eliza is teaching now in Asheville. She always was bright as a button. Martha Freeman must be so proud. They worked so hard to give those children opportunities, even when the white folks tried to hold them back. Another letter, from 1922, mentioned Oak Ridge School. I heard that schoolhouse burned down. Part of me is glad. Too many bad memories there. But I pray they build a new one that welcomes all children, regardless of color. Every child deserves to learn. As Margaret prepared to leave, Evelyn walked her out to the porch. The view stretched across the valley, mountains rolling away into the blue distance. The late afternoon light painted everything in golden tones. "Dr. Hayes," Evelyn said, "what are you going to do with all this information?" "I'm going to write an article for an academic journal," Margaret said. "And I'm working on a public exhibition for the Watauga County Historical Society. I want people to understand what happened here. These children existed. They mattered. They deserved to be in that photograph and in the history books." Evelyn nodded. "My mother would have liked that. She always said the hardest part wasn't the discrimination itself, as terrible as that was, but the feeling that nobody cared. That her story didn't matter. That she could disappear and nobody would notice. She said being invisible was worse than being mistreated, because at least when you're mistreated, people acknowledge you exist." "I promise you," Margaret said, "I will make sure people notice. I will make sure your mother and all those children are remembered." Evelyn reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Thank you. You're doing important work. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Back in her university office, Margaret compiled everything she had learned. She had traced 3 of the 12 families. The others remained elusive, their trails lost to time, migration, and incomplete records. But the 3 families she had found told a powerful story. She spent a week reading Eliza Freeman's diary, carefully transcribing passages that revealed the inner life of a young black girl growing up in the segregated South. Eliza's writing was articulate and insightful, revealing a keen intelligence and a determination to succeed despite obstacles. She wrote about her love of learning, her frustration with injustice, her dreams of becoming a teacher. One entry, dated June 1910, particularly moved Margaret. "I will not let them make me small. I will not let their cruelty convince me I am less than I am. I know I am smart. I know I am worthy. Someday I will stand in front of a classroom, and I will teach children that they are valuable no matter what anyone says. That is my promise to myself." Margaret examined the 1907 photograph again, this time with fresh eyes. She could see it now, not as a charming historical artifact, but as a document of exclusion. Those 40 white children on the steps had been privileged to have their childhood immortalized on film, to be remembered, to become part of the official history. The black children who had been pushed aside, told they weren't regular students, had been erased from that history. But they had lived. They had learned. They had grown up, raised families, and contributed to their communities. Eliza Freeman had become a beloved teacher. Jacob Wilson had worked hard to ensure his children received the education he was denied. Rose Davis had returned to the mountains she loved, carrying the stories forward. Their erasure from one photograph didn't erase them from existence. But it had shaped how they saw themselves and how they were seen by others. It had sent a message about whose lives mattered, whose stories deserved to be told. Margaret began writing. She wrote late into the night, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She wrote about Eliza Freeman, 12 years old, standing to the side while her classmates smiled for the camera. She wrote about the families who had organized their own school, refusing to let their children remain uneducated. She wrote about the resilience and dignity that had allowed them to survive and even thrive despite systematic discrimination. And she wrote about the photograph itself, what it showed and what it deliberately excluded. She titled her article, "Outside the Frame, The Invisible Students of Oak Ridge School, 1907. The article would be published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies 6 months later. But Margaret knew that academic publication wasn't enough. These stories needed to reach a wider audience. They needed to be part of the public memory. She picked up the phone and called Thomas Gardner at the Historical Society. "Thomas," she said, "I want to create an exhibition. I want to tell this story to everyone who visits Watauga County. Are you willing to help me?" "Absolutely," Thomas replied without hesitation. "It's time we told the whole truth about our history." "Past time, really?" The exhibition opened at the Watauga County Historical Society on a Saturday morning in October 2020. Due to COVID-19 restrictions, attendance was limited, but local television stations sent reporters, and word spread quickly through social media. What had started as one historian's curiosity about a school photograph was becoming a conversation that the community, and eventually the nation, needed to have. Margaret had spent months designing the exhibition with Thomas and a team of volunteers. The process had been challenging, requiring countless decisions about how to present painful history in a way that was honest but not exploitative, educational but not sterile. They had consulted with descendants of both white and black families, seeking input on how to tell this story responsibly. The centerpiece was an enlargement of the 1907 school photograph, mounted on the wall with a stark question beside it in simple black letters: "Who isn't in this picture?" Surrounding the photograph were panels telling the stories of the Freeman, Wilson, and Davis families. There were census records, property deeds, and family photographs from later years. There were excerpts from Eliza Freeman's diary, her handwriting preserved and enlarged so visitors could read her own words about growing up in the mountains. Margaret had selected passages that revealed Eliza's intelligence, her dreams, her humanity. One panel displayed newspaper articles from the era showing how pervasive Jim Crow segregation had been in North Carolina. Another panel explained the funding structure that allowed schools to count black students for state aid while excluding them from educational opportunities. A third panel showed the broader context of the Great Migration, with statistics about how many African Americans had left the rural South seeking better lives, and a map showing the paths families like the Freemans, Wilsons, and Devises had taken. But the most powerful element was in the center of the exhibition, a recreation of the 1907 photograph with the missing children added. Margaret had worked with a talented digital artist to create silhouettes of children in period-appropriate clothing, positioned where they might have stood. The silhouettes were rendered in black, making them clearly distinguishable from the original photograph. Beneath each silhouette was a name and age: Eliza Freeman, age 12. Isaiah Freeman, age 14. Thomas Freeman, age 9. Grace Freeman, age 7. Jacob Wilson, age 11. Mary Wilson, age 8. Samuel Wilson, age 6. Lillian Davis, age 10. Rose Davis, age 8. And for the children whose names Margaret hadn't been able to confirm through her research, the silhouette simply said, "Unknown child." There were 12 silhouettes in total, representing the approximate number of black children who should have been in that photograph. The exhibition included a guest book where visitors could leave comments. On opening day, Dorothy Jackson Williams drove up from Charlotte with her daughter and grandchildren. Evelyn Carmichael came from her mountain home. Marcus Wilson flew in from Ohio. They stood together in front of the recreated photograph, looking at the silhouettes of their ancestors. "My grandmother is visible now," Dorothy said quietly, tears running down her face. Finally, she's visible. She would have been so proud to know that people are remembering her, honoring her story. Marcus Wilson stood silently for a long time, staring at the silhouette labeled Jacob Wilson, age 11. Finally, he said, "My grandfather spent his whole life trying to prove he mattered. He didn't need to prove anything. He always mattered. But the world made him feel like he had to." Evelyn placed her hand on the silhouette of her mother. "She's home now. This is where her story belongs, here in these mountains she loved." Local television coverage of the exhibition sparked regional and then national interest. NPR picked up the story for a segment on Morning Edition. The New York Times sent a reporter who wrote a feature article titled, "The Children Who Weren't There: How One Photograph Reveals America's Racial History." What had started as one historian's curiosity about a school photograph had become a conversation about how we remember history and whose stories get told. The exhibition went viral on social media. People began sharing their own family stories of exclusion and erasure. Educators requested permission to use the materials in their classrooms. Other historians reached out to Margaret, sharing similar discoveries they had made in their own research. Not everyone was happy about the exhibition. Margaret received emails from people who said she was stirring up trouble, that she should let the past stay in the past. Some accused her of having a political agenda, of being divisive. One email read, "Why do you want to make white people feel guilty? That photograph was taken over 100 years ago. Nobody alive today had anything to do with it. Margaret crafted a careful response that she posted on the Historical Society's website. This exhibition isn't about guilt. It's about truth. Understanding our history, all of it including the painful parts, doesn't divide us. Ignoring that history, pretending it didn't happen, that's what creates division. These children existed. They deserved to be remembered. Telling their story doesn't diminish anyone else's story. It simply makes our history more complete, more honest, more human. But she also received hundreds of messages of support. Teachers wrote to say they were using the exhibition materials in their classrooms, sparking important conversations about race, history, and justice. Genealogists shared stories of their own ancestors who had been erased from official histories. Descendants of other excluded families reached out, hoping Margaret could help them uncover their own family stories. One email came from a woman in Virginia whose grandmother had attended a segregated school in the 1910s. She wrote, "My grandmother died 20 years ago, but she told me stories about being excluded from her school photograph. I didn't understand the significance then, but your exhibition helped me realize that her experience wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic pattern of making Black children invisible. Thank you for honoring their memories." 3 months after the exhibition opened, the Watauga County Board of Education held a special meeting. The board chairman, a man in his 60s named Robert Patterson, stood at the podium. Margaret sat in the audience between Dorothy and Thomas, her heart pounding with anticipation. "This county has a complicated history," Patterson began, his voice carrying through the room. "Like much of the South, we've often preferred to remember the parts of our past that make us comfortable and forget the parts that make us ashamed. We've celebrated our pioneer heritage, our agricultural traditions, our mountain culture. But we haven't been honest about who was excluded from that celebration." He paused, looking out at the audience that included Margaret, Dorothy, Evelyn, several school board members, and dozens of community members, both Black and white, young and old. The exhibition at the Historical Society has reminded us that we can't move forward if we're not honest about where we've been. Those Black children who were excluded from the 1907 school photograph weren't just statistics or abstract historical figures. They were real children with names and families and dreams. They deserved better than they received. And we, as a community, owe them the acknowledgement that they existed and that they mattered. Patterson cleared his throat, emotion evident in his voice. The board has voted unanimously to commission a permanent memorial at the site of the former Oak Ridge School. The memorial will tell the true story of education in this community, all students who attended, not just the ones who were deemed worthy of being photographed. We will also establish the Oak Ridge Scholarship Fund, which will provide educational grants to students from historically underserved communities in Watauga County. The fund will be endowed with $100,000 from the county education budget, and we will seek additional donations from community members. The audience applauded. It wasn't a perfect solution. Nothing could undo the injustice done to those children in 1907, but it was an acknowledgement that their stories mattered. It was a step toward a more honest reckoning with history. Margaret attended the dedication of the memorial on a bright May morning in 2021, almost exactly 114 years after that photograph had been taken. The memorial stood in a clearing surrounded by trees, on land that had once been the Oak Ridge School property. It consisted of a stone marker with a bronze plaque bearing the names of the students who had been excluded from the photograph, along with a brief history of what had happened. The day was perfect: warm sun, blue sky, the smell of honeysuckle in the air. About 100 people gathered for the ceremony, including descendants of families who had attended Oak Ridge School, both Black and white. Local dignitaries gave speeches about the importance of remembering history and learning from past mistakes. Dorothy Jackson Williams, now 83, stood at the memorial with her hand on the plaque, her fingers tracing her grandmother's name. Eliza Freeman Jackson, she read aloud. 1895 to 1984. She stood outside the frame, but she was never invisible. She turned to the assembled crowd, her voice strong despite her age. "My grandmother once told me that being excluded from that photograph was one of the defining moments of her life. Not because the photograph itself was so important, but because of what it represented. It told her that the world saw her as less than human, as someone who didn't deserve to be remembered. But she refused to accept that judgment. She lived her life with dignity and purpose. She became a teacher and spent 40 years telling Black children that they mattered, that they were important, that nobody had the right to make them feel invisible. Dorothy's eyes swept across the crowd. This memorial doesn't undo what happened to my grandmother and those other children, but it acknowledges the truth. It says their lives had value. It says we remember. And that matters more than you might think. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat on a bench near the memorial with Thomas Gardner. The spring afternoon was warm, and birds sang in the surrounding forest. Most of the crowd had dispersed, but a few people still lingered, reading the memorial plaque, taking photographs. "Do you think this makes a difference?" Thomas asked. "A memorial, an exhibition, does it actually change anything?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I don't think it erases the past or repairs the damage that was done. Those children grew up in a world that told them they were less than human. That pain doesn't disappear just because we acknowledge it now." Eliza Freeman carried the wound of that exclusion her entire life. Nothing we do today changes what she experienced. But yes, I think it matters. When we tell the truth about history, all of it, not just the comfortable parts, we make it harder for those same injustices to happen again. We say to the descendants of those families, "Your ancestors' lives had meaning. Their struggles weren't in vain. They were human beings who deserved dignity, and we refuse to forget them." Thomas nodded. Eliza Freeman's granddaughter said something to me earlier. She said that her grandmother always felt invisible. This makes her visible. Margaret thought about all the historical photographs she had studied over her career, all the images that showed part of the story while carefully excluding other parts. How many other invisible children were there, standing just outside the frame? How many stories had been lost because someone decided they weren't worth recording? "I'm going to keep researching," she said. "There are 9 more families from that school who I haven't been able to trace." And Oak Ridge was just one school. There were hundreds of schools across Appalachia, across the South, across the country where Black children were excluded, marginalized, or erased. Each of those children had a story. "That's a lot of work," Thomas said. Margaret smiled. "That's why I became a historian. To find the stories that were hidden. To bring the invisible into focus. To challenge the official narratives that tell only part of the truth." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the memorial clearing, Margaret thought about the circular nature of history. That 1907 photograph had been taken to commemorate a moment, to preserve a memory of childhood and community. But it had done more than that. It had documented an injustice, evidence of a society that saw some children as worthy of remembrance and others as disposable. Now, more than a century later, that same photograph was teaching a different lesson. It was showing new generations the cost of discrimination, the importance of questioning official narratives, and the power of bringing hidden stories to light. Dorothy approached Margaret as people began leaving the dedication ceremony. "Dr. Hayes, I want you to have something." She pulled out a small frame containing a photograph Margaret had never seen before. It showed an elderly Eliza Freeman sitting in a rocking chair on a front porch, her face lined with age but her eyes still sharp and intelligent. A gentle smile played at her lips. "This was taken about a year before grandmother died," Dorothy explained. "I've had it in my house all these years, but I think it belongs with the other materials you've collected. I want people to see her as she was, not just as a silhouette or a name on a memorial, but as a real person who lived a full life. She raised 4 children. She taught hundreds of students. She made quilts and grew vegetables and sang in the church choir. She was more than the girl who was excluded from a photograph. She was a complete human being." Margaret accepted the photograph with reverence. "Thank you. I'll make sure it's properly archived and displayed. And Dorothy, thank you for trusting me with your grandmother's story." Dorothy smiled. "You know what? I think my grandmother would have liked you. She always said that the truth matters, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. She said lies are comfortable but truth sets you free." As Margaret drove away from the memorial site that evening, she carried with her the photograph of Eliza Freeman, the weight of these stories, and a renewed commitment to uncovering hidden histories. She understood now that history wasn't just about dates and events recorded in textbooks. It was about the individual lives that were shaped by those events, the children who stood outside the frame, the families who persevered despite injustice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The exhibition continued to draw visitors. Over the next year, it would travel to other historical societies and museums across North Carolina and then to other states. The scholarship fund grew as donations poured in from people moved by the story. Within 2 years, it had awarded grants to 35 students, many of them the first in their families to attend college. The 1907 photograph of Oak Ridge School would never be just an innocent image again. It would forever be a reminder that photographs, like all historical documents, tell a story about power, who gets to be seen, who gets to be remembered, and whose humanity gets acknowledged. But now, thanks to Margaret's research and the community's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, those invisible children were finally being seen. Their names were spoken aloud. Their stories were being told. They were no longer outside the frame. And in that small but significant act of remembrance, there was a kind of justice, imperfect and long delayed, but justice nonetheless. The exhibition would eventually travel to other towns and cities, sparking conversations about local histories and hidden stories. The scholarship fund would help dozens of students pursue higher education, creating opportunities that those 1907 children had been denied. The memorial would stand for generations, ensuring that the students of Oak Ridge School, all of them, would not be forgotten. Margaret Hayes would continue her research, finding more invisible children in more photographs, more hidden stories in more archives. She collaborated with other historians, building a network of scholars committed to telling more complete histories. She mentored graduate students who wanted to uncover the hidden stories of their own communities. She gave lectures and wrote articles and consulted on documentary films. But on that May evening, driving through the Appalachian Mountains with Eliza Freeman's photograph on the seat beside her, she allowed herself to feel that she had made a difference. She had helped bring truth to light. She had honored the dignity of people who had been denied it in their own time. She had taken children who had been deliberately made invisible and brought them back into focus, back into memory, back into the story of their community. The mountains rolled away into the twilight, ancient and enduring. The same mountains that had witnessed the injustice of 1907 now witnessed this act of remembrance and reconciliation. The land remembered, even when people tried to forget. And now, finally, the full story was being told. Margaret knew this was just one photograph, one school, one community. But every story mattered. Every act of remembrance mattered. Every effort to tell the truth about history, no matter how uncomfortable, moved society one small step closer to justice. As darkness settled over the mountains and stars began to appear in the deepening blue sky, Margaret thought about Eliza Freeman as a 12-year-old girl, standing aside while her classmates had their photograph taken. And she thought about Eliza as an old woman, at peace with her life, hoping someone would remember. Someone did remember. Many people did. And that made all the difference.